The moment my dad started laughing in that enormous dining room, I felt the floor shift under my feet. Not metaphorically, my knees actually went weak, and I grabbed the edge of the table just to stay upright, because I knew that laugh. That quiet, slow laugh my dad does when someone has just made the worst mistake of their life without realizing it yet. And Diane Whitmore, standing there in her $6 million mansion in her silk blouse and her perfectly blown-out hair, had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to her. But let me back up, because none of this makes any sense without the 4 years that came before it. My name is Cora. I'm 24 years old, and I'm an auto mechanic at a shop called Sullivan's off Route 9 in a quiet suburb called Maplewood, just outside Columbus, Ohio. I know what you're picturing. A greasy bay, a radio playing country, a woman with calluses on her hands who drives a truck with a cracked taillight. You're not entirely wrong. I love my job. I love the smell of engine oil and the way a car sounds when you finally fix what's wrong with it. I love that the work is real and honest, and you can see exactly what you've done at the end of the day. I met Garrett Whitmore when he came in with a 2019 Audi A5 that was making a sound like a dying raccoon under the hood. I diagnosed a cracked serpentine belt in about 40 seconds. He looked at me like I'd just performed surgery. We talked for 20 minutes while I wrote up the work order. He came back the next day to pick up the car and asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes, mostly because he was cute and also because I'd been single for almost 2 years, and my parakeet, Orbit, was getting tired of being my primary source of conversation. That was 4 years ago. 4 years of inside jokes and weekend drives, and arguing over whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie. It is. And slowly, carefully building something that felt solid. Garrett is 31 now, works in project management for a construction firm downtown, and is the kind of person who remembers that you mentioned once, in passing, that you like the raspberry Danish from the bakery on 5th Street and shows up with one on a bad day. We moved in together after about 18 months, into a rental house 2 streets over from where I grew up. We got Orbit from a rescue when I was 22, a little green and yellow parakeet who screams, "Pretty bird," at exactly 7 a.m. every morning without fail, and has strong opinions about true crime podcasts. Life was genuinely good. Not rich good, not Instagram good, but real good. The kind of good where you wake up on a Tuesday and feel okay about everything. The first time I met Diane Whitmore was at Thanksgiving the year after Garrett and I started dating. She lived in Westerville, about 25 minutes north, in a house that I later found out Garrett's late grandfather had purchased in the 80s. Garrett's father, Robert, had passed away when Garrett was 19, a heart attack, sudden and cruel. After that, it was just Diane and the house and, apparently, a very specific vision of what her son's future was supposed to look like. I did not fit that vision. I could tell from the moment she shook my hand. Her eyes moved from my face to my work-roughened hands to my clearance rack blazer, and something in her expression settled into a polite, cold smile that never quite reached her eyes the entire night. She wasn't outright rude at that first dinner. She was something more sophisticated than rude. She was dismissive in ways that were deniable. She asked me questions and then turned away before I finished answering. She talked around me to Garrett's aunt about a friend's son who had just graduated from law school. She mentioned, twice unprompted, that a girl Garrett had dated in college was doing so well at some finance firm in Chicago. I drove home that night with my jaw tight and Garrett's hand on my knee, and he said, "She just needs time. She's protective." I nodded and didn't say what I was actually thinking, which was, that woman doesn't need time. She's already made up her mind. But I was patient, because I loved Garrett, and because I've dealt with people who underestimate me my whole life. When you're a female mechanic in your early 20s, being underestimated is basically a job requirement. I'm used to it. I know how to wait. The thing about Diane was that she was smarter than your average snob. She never gave me a single moment I could point to and say, "There, that's the thing she did." It was always ambient, always plausibly deniable. A comment here, a slight there, a way of arranging seating at family dinners so that I was always next to the most boring person in the room while she held court at the other end of the table. For 4 years, I navigated it. I brought good wine to her gatherings. I remembered her birthday. I was polite and warm, and I never, not once, let her see that she got to me. Garrett appreciated it, even if he never fully acknowledged how hard I was working. I think he genuinely couldn't see the full shape of what his mother was doing because he'd been inside it his whole life. It just looked like normal to him. Then, in early April, things changed. The weather had just started to turn. You know those first warm days in April when the air smells like mud and new grass, and everyone in the Midwest exhales for the first time since October. I was at the shop, sleeves rolled up, elbow deep in a 17 Silverado's transmission, when Garrett called me on my lunch break. His voice had that careful, measured tone he uses when he's about to tell me something he thinks I'm not going to like. "My mom wants to have dinner," he said, "this Saturday. She wants your parents to come." I set down my sandwich. "My parents?" "Yeah, she said she wants to. I think her words were, finally get to know them properly. She's been saying she feels like she doesn't really know your family after all this time." I stared at the wall of the break room. There was a calendar on it from 2022 that nobody had ever taken down. I remember looking at the picture of a mountain on it and thinking, very clearly, something is wrong with this. Because here's the thing about Diane Whitmore. She had never, in 4 years, expressed a single genuine interest in my parents. My mom, Peggy, is a retired school librarian. My dad, Walt, is a contractor. They own a house on Clover Street about 3 miles from where Garrett and I live. They are the most decent, unpretentious people I have ever known. They drive used cars and grow tomatoes. And my dad watches too many History Channel specials, and my mom volunteers at the public library even though she doesn't have to anymore. Diane had met them exactly twice, once at Thanksgiving 2 years ago and once at a birthday party for Garrett's cousin, and both times she had been pleasant in the way that people are pleasant to service workers they'll never see again. She had never called them by their first names without being prompted. She had never asked a single follow-up question about their lives. And now, out of absolutely nowhere, she wanted to invite them to her home for dinner? "Cora," Garrett said, "you still there?" "Yeah," I said, "I'm here." I think it would mean a lot to her. She's really trying. I wanted to say, "No, she isn't." I wanted to say, "Your mother has never once tried." But instead I said, "Okay, I'll ask them." Because I am 24 years old and I am still, apparently, capable of being talked into things by a man with a kind voice and good intentions. I called my mom that evening. She was excited, genuinely, sweetly excited. She asked what she should wear and whether she should bring something. My stomach hurt the entire time I was talking to her. I had a feeling, not a thought, not a theory, just a feeling, low and cold in my gut, that this dinner was not what Garrett thought it was. I didn't say any of that to my mom. I just told her to wear whatever she was comfortable in and that she didn't need to bring anything. Saturday came, the first warm Saturday of April, the kind of day where you could almost convince yourself that winter had actually ended for real this time. Orbit was doing his morning routine when I got dressed, screaming, "Pretty bird!" at the window, bobbing his little head at his reflection like he'd never seen anything so magnificent. I scratched the top of his head with one finger before I left, and he made the small, contented sound he makes when he's pleased, and I thought, at least someone in this household is having a great day. Diane's house, the house that I did not yet know my father owned, sat at the end of a long driveway lined with ornamental cherry trees that were just starting to bloom. $6 million. That's what the Zillow estimate was when I looked it up once, feeling petty and curious. 7 bedrooms, 5.5 baths, a guest cottage, an actual wine cellar. The kind of house that announces itself before you even get to the door. My parents were already there when we arrived. My dad was standing in the driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the cherry trees with an expression I couldn't quite read. My mom was beside him, clutching her purse, wearing her nicest cardigan, the blue one she saves for church and special occasions. They both looked so genuinely, heartbreakingly normal standing in front of that house, so entirely themselves. My dad turned when he heard my car and smiled. Just a regular smile, but his eyes were doing something else, something quiet and watchful that I recognized from childhood. He looked the way he looked when he already knew the answer to a question and was waiting to see if you'd figure it out. I should have asked him about it right then. I should have pulled him aside before we even walked through that door. Instead, I hugged him, straightened his collar out of habit, and we all went inside together. Diane met us in the foyer. She was dressed impeccably, of course, wide-leg trousers, a cream blouse, jewelry that looked understated and cost more than my car. She kissed Garrett on the cheek, gave me a smile that was all surface, and then turned to my parents with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something that looked almost like anticipation. "Walt, Peggy," she said, gesturing around the entry hall. "Welcome to my home. What do you think?" My mom said something gracious about the architecture. My dad just looked around slowly, the same careful way he looks at a job site when he's calculating something. Then he nodded once, like he'd confirmed a thought. We moved into the dining room. The table was set for 6. Diane, Garrett, me, my parents, and Diane's sister Renata, who I had met once before and who had her sister's same talent for smiling without meaning it. There was wine already poured, the kind of dinner where everything is beautiful and nothing is warm. And that's when it started. It didn't start dramatically. It started the way all really dangerous things start, slowly, casually, like it was nothing. Renata asked my dad what he did for work. He said he was a contractor. Diane tilted her head with that practiced smile and said, "Oh, how practical. It must be so nice to work with your hands." The kind of compliment that isn't one. My mom talked about her years at the library, and Renata nodded the way you nod when someone is telling you something that doesn't interest you at all. And then Diane set down her wine glass, looked directly at my mother and said it, clear as anything, calm as anything. "You know, I've always thought it takes a certain kind of courage," she said, "for people from modest backgrounds to try to move up in the world. It really does. I just hope everyone understands how these things actually work." She paused. "Broke nobodies think they can crawl into high society." And then she smiled, like she'd said something reasonable. "I just think it's important to be realistic." The table went absolutely silent. My face went hot. My mom's face went carefully, painfully still, the way it does when she's trying very hard not to cry. Renata looked at her wine glass. Garrett looked at me with an expression that was half apology and half paralysis. And my dad looked at Diane Whitmore for a long moment. Then, slowly, he started to laugh. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a real one, low and quiet and completely unhurried. Diane blinked. "I'm sorry, Walt, I don't see what's—" "Diane," my dad said, and his voice was perfectly level, perfectly pleasant. "I'm not renting this mansion to you anymore." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, set it on the table beside his wine glass, smooth and unhurried, like he was laying down a card he'd been holding all evening. Diane stared at the paper, then at my dad, then back at the paper. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice had lost exactly half its certainty. "What did you just say?" "I said I'm not renewing your lease," my dad repeated. He unfolded the paper with 2 fingers, turned it around, and slid it across the white tablecloth toward her. "This is the property at 4417 Hartwell Drive, Westerville, Ohio. I've owned it since 2011. Your lease is up at the end of May. I've decided not to renew." He picked up his wine glass and took a calm, unhurried sip. "So you've got about 6 weeks to make arrangements." The room was absolutely airless. I looked at Garrett. Garrett looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under him. His face was doing something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of slow, sequential collapse, like a building settling floor by floor. His mouth was open slightly. His hand, which had been resting near his wine glass, had gone completely still. Renata set down her fork with a small, precise clink. Diane looked at the paper. She looked at it for a long time. When she finally looked up, The polished composure was still there, but it had cracks running through it now, fine ones, the kind you only see when the light hits just right. "Walt," she said carefully, "I think there may be some confusion." "No confusion," my dad said pleasantly. "I bought the property from Gerald Ashworth in March of 2011. He needed to liquidate quickly, estate situation. His wife had passed. I got a fair price. You were already living here on a month-to-month at that point. I had my attorney draw up a proper lease. Your attorney reviewed it. You signed. We've had a good arrangement for 14 years. I just won't be continuing it." "You've been my landlord," Diane said slowly, like she was testing the words to see if they would shatter. "For 14 years. "I have." "And you never said—" "You never asked." My dad set down his wine glass. He wasn't smiling anymore, but he wasn't unkind either. He was just utterly, completely matter-of-fact. "The property management company handles everything. There was no reason for us to interact directly. Until tonight, I suppose." My mother, bless her, was looking at her hands in her lap. I could see from the slight tremor in her shoulders that she was trying very hard not to laugh. I was not trying hard at all. I had both hands flat on the table, and I was staring at the centerpiece, a tall arrangement of white tulips in a glass vase, focusing on it with everything I had, because if I looked at anyone's face right now, I was going to completely lose it. "How much?" Garrett said, and his voice came out strange and thin. "How much is the rent?" My dad looked at him. $9,200 a month. Garrett closed his eyes. $9,200 a month. For 14 years. I did the math without meaning to, the numbers just assembling themselves in my head. Over $1.5 million. My father, the contractor who drove a used F-150 and grew tomatoes and watched too many History Channel specials, had quietly collected over $1.5 million in rent from the woman who had just called my mother a nobody at her own dinner table. His dinner table, as it turned out. "This is—" Diane stopped, started again. "This is completely inappropriate. You should have disclosed this the moment Garrett and Cora began their relationship. There's a clear conflict of—" "There's no conflict," my dad said. "I'm your landlord, not your family member. I had no legal or ethical obligation to disclose a private business arrangement. You're welcome to consult an attorney if you'd like a second opinion on that." He said it the way you say something when you already know what every attorney in the state is going to tell her. Diane turned to Garrett. And here is where I saw it, the thing I should have seen coming but didn't, because I'd been so focused on my dad and the piece of paper and the slow-motion implosion of Diane's composure. She turned to her son and her expression shifted. The cracks sealed over. The polish came back, and she said, in a voice that was very soft and very deliberate, "Garrett, sweetheart, I need you to talk to your girlfriend's father. Not my fiancé, not my partner, my girlfriend's father. Like I was 20 and we'd been dating for 3 months. Garrett looked at her, then he looked at me, and I watched something happen behind his eyes that I felt in my stomach like a drop. He looked away from me first. Walt, he said. She's been here a long time. This is her home. Surely there's a way to—" "Garrett." I said his name quietly. Just his name, nothing else. He stopped. I looked at him for a moment. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and I thought, okay, I see you. I see exactly where you're standing right now. And I filed it away, the way you file something you know you're going to need to look at later, when you're not sitting at a table with your parents and your boyfriend's mother and a lease termination notice and a centerpiece of white tulips. My dad stood up. He did it slowly, the way he does everything. No drama, no performance. He picked up his copy of the notice, folded it back into his pocket. "I think we've said what needed to be said," he told Diane. "The formal notice will arrive by certified mail on Monday. 60 days as per the lease terms." He looked at Renata, who had not said a single word since the paper hit the table. "Thank you for dinner," he said, though we hadn't actually eaten anything worth mentioning. Then he looked at my mom and held out his hand. My mom took it, stood up, and said to Diane very gently, "I hope you find something lovely." Then she picked up her purse. They walked out together. My dad didn't look back. The 4 of us, me, Garrett, Diane, Renata, sat in the wreckage of the dinner for about 10 seconds of pure silence. Then Diane said very quietly to no one in particular, "I had no idea." "Clearly," I said. She looked at me, and for just a moment beneath all that composed fury and humiliation, I saw something else, something that looked almost like fear. Not of losing the house, I realized, something older than that. The fear of someone who has spent years building a very precise architecture of superiority and has just watched one load-bearing wall walk out the door in a jacket from Costco. I excused myself and followed my parents out. In the driveway, under the cherry trees that were dropping pale pink blossoms onto the hoods of our cars, my dad was leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, looking perfectly comfortable, like a man who had just listened a moderately interesting errand. "Dad," I said, "how long have you known about tonight?" He looked at me. "Known what about tonight?" That she was going to do something like that she was going to invite Mom and me there to make a point. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know specifically," he said, "but I've known about Diane Whitmore for a long time, Cora. Garrett told me things early on. Small things. The way you'd describe something that bothers you but that you don't think is a big deal." He paused. "It was a big deal." "Why didn't you say anything? To me, to Garrett?" "Because you needed to see it yourself." He said it without apology. "And because I wanted to be in the room when she said it out loud." My mom put her hand on my arm. "Come have dinner with us," she said. "Real dinner. I've got that leftover chicken soup from Thursday." I stood there for a second, looking back at the house. The lights in the dining room were still on. I could see the shape of Diane through the gauzy curtains standing very still. I wondered what she was saying to Garrett right now. I wondered what Garrett was saying back. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked at it. Garrett. The text said, "Can you come back inside? She wants to apologize." I stared at that message for longer than I should have, because here's the thing about a false hope. It doesn't feel false when it arrives. It feels exactly like relief. It feels like the thing you've been quietly wanting for 4 years, the moment where the difficult person finally sees you, finally admits what they've been doing, and everything gets easier. That's what his text felt like for about 15 seconds. Then I thought about the way he'd looked away from me at that table, the way he'd said, "Surely there's a way," before he'd said a single word to me, the way he'd called my dad Walt and not Sir and not Please, just Walt, like he was negotiating with a stranger about a business problem that had inconveniently landed in his lap. I put my phone back in my pocket. "Yeah," I said to my mom, "chicken soup sounds really good." I drove to my parents' house. I sat at their kitchen table, the same one I'd done homework at for 12 years, with the water ring stain near the corner that my dad had tried to fix 3 times and finally given up on, and I ate soup, and I didn't look at my phone. Orbit was at home in his cage, probably asleep by now, probably muttering "pretty bird" under his breath in his sleep the way he does. The house would be quiet. And Garrett was sitting in that enormous dining room with his mother, in a house my father owned, trying to figure out what to say to me. My phone buzzed again. I didn't pick it up. My dad came and sat across from me with a mug of coffee and didn't say anything for a while, which is one of the things I love most about him. He doesn't fill silence with noise. He just lets it be what it is. "She's going to fight the lease termination," I said. "She can try," he said. "Lease terms are clear. She signed them." "And Garrett," I stopped. "What happens with Garrett?" My dad looked at his coffee. "That's not a question I can answer for you." I knew that. I knew that even as I asked it. But what I didn't say, what I was only just beginning to understand as I sat there in my parents' kitchen with the water ring stain and the sound of the refrigerator hum and the particular ordinary safety of a house that had always been exactly what it appeared to be, was that there was a second question underneath the first one. And it wasn't about Garrett at all. It was about what Garrett had done tonight when it mattered, and what that meant about everything I'd thought I knew. My phone buzzed a 3rd time. I turned it face down on the table. And then, just as I was starting to breathe normally again, my mom came in from the hallway with a look on her face that I recognized immediately. The look she gets when she's heard something she didn't mean to hear and doesn't know how to start saying it. "Cora," she said carefully, "There's something your dad and I haven't told you yet." I looked at my mom standing in the kitchen doorway, and the expression on her face made something cold settle into my chest. My mom is not a dramatic person. She doesn't do the look unless there's something real behind it. This was the look she'd had when she told me my grandfather was sick. The look she'd had when she sat me down at this same table when I was 16 to explain that our neighbor's husband had left without warning, and that sometimes people do things that don't make sense, and it's not your fault for not seeing it coming. "What is it?" I said. She came and sat down next to me. My dad didn't move, but I felt him settle into stillness in a particular way, the way he settles when he already knows what's coming and is just waiting to be present for it. "We've known about the property longer than tonight," my mom said. "The Hartwell Drive property. We've known what it was, who lived there, since about 6 months after you started seeing Garrett." I set down my spoon. "What?" "Your dad found out when he was reviewing the lease files with his property manager. They were updating the contact information, and Garrett's last name came up. Whitmore. And we'd just met him, and it was obvious pretty quickly that this was the same family." She folded her hands on the table. "We talked about whether to tell you." "And you decided not to?" "We decided," my dad said, "to wait and see what kind of people they were, because at that point we didn't know. We knew she was your dad's tenant. We didn't know she was—" He paused, choosing the word carefully. "We didn't know who she was yet." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, a car went past on the street, its headlights sweeping across the kitchen curtains and then gone. "So for 3.5 years," I said slowly, "every time I came home and told you about something she'd said, something she'd done, you already knew you owned her house." "Yes," my dad said, simply, without flinching. "And you never said anything?" "No." I pushed back from the table. Not dramatically, I didn't knock anything over, didn't storm out. I just needed to not be sitting down for a second. I stood up and went to the window and looked out at the backyard, at the dark shape of the garden beds where the tomatoes would go in another few weeks, at the ordinary quiet darkness of a Saturday night in a neighborhood that was just a neighborhood. I understood on some level why they'd done it. I understood the logic of it. Wait and see. Don't introduce a complication until you know whether it's necessary. My dad doesn't move on incomplete information. He never has. It's what makes him good at his job. You don't tear out a wall until you know what's behind it. But I had been the one sitting at that table tonight. I had been the one whose mother was called a nobody. And somewhere between understanding the logic and feeling the thing, there was a gap, and right now I was standing in it. "I'm not angry," I said to the window. I was testing the sentence as I said it, checking whether it was true. It was mostly true. I need a minute." "Take whatever you need," my mom said. I turned around. "Did you know she was going to do something like that tonight? Specifically?" My dad shook his head. "No, I knew she was capable of it. I didn't know she'd be foolish enough to do it in her own dining room. In my dining room." He said the last 3 words quietly, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite satisfaction, more like a very specific kind of tiredness, the tiredness of a person who has been patient for a very long time and is finally, at the end of it, just done. I went back to the table. I picked up my phone, which was still face down, and I turned it over. 4 messages from Garrett. The first: "Can you come back inside? She wants to apologize." The second, 20 minutes later: "Cora, I know you're upset. I am too. Can we please talk?" The third: "I'm sorry about tonight. I didn't know she was going to say that." The fourth, which had come in while I was standing at the window: "I think we need to talk about what your dad did too. This is a lot to process." I read that last one twice. What your dad did. Like the thing that needed processing was not what Diane had said to my mother's face, but my father's response to it. Like those 2 things lived in the same moral neighborhood. I put the phone back down, face down again. "He wants to talk about what my dad did," I said. My mom made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, small and controlled, the kind she makes when she's heard something and is actively deciding not to say her full opinion of it. My dad said nothing. He drank his coffee. I sat there for a long time after that, long enough that my mom got up and refilled my soup bowl even though I hadn't asked, and I ate it because she'd made it and because my body was doing the automatic things bodies do when the mind is somewhere else entirely. The soup was good. It was always good. She makes it with dill from the garden, dried and kept in a jar on the spice rack, and it tastes exactly like every winter of my childhood. I drove home around 10. Garrett's car was in the driveway. I sat in my car for a moment before going in. I looked at the house, our rental house, 2 streets from where I grew up, the one with the slightly crooked mailbox that we kept meaning to fix and never did. There was a light on in the living room. I could see it through the curtain. I thought about what I was going to say. I thought about what he was going to say. I thought about his text, what your dad did, and the way he'd looked away from me at the table. And I thought about 4 years of good mornings and bad days, and the raspberry Danish from the bakery on 5th Street. Then I went inside. Garrett was on the couch. He'd taken off his jacket and tie. He looked tired in a way that was genuine, not performed, not strategic, just tired. He looked up when I came in and said, "Hey." "Hey," I said. "Are you okay?" "Not really," I said. I hung up my keys. I didn't sit down. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't know she was going to say that. I want you to know that. If I had known." "You would have what?" I asked. "Told her not to? Or just not invited my parents?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "Garrett." I came and stood in front of him, not close, not confrontational, just standing. "She called my mother a nobody at a dinner she arranged, and your first response was to ask her if she could apologize and then text me about what my dad did." "I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own answer. Orbit was in his cage in the corner, silent, which meant he was already asleep, little head tucked under his wing. The only sound was the refrigerator and the distant noise of the street. "She's still my mother," Garrett finally said. "I know she is," I said. "I have never once asked you to stop loving her, not once in 4 years. But she stood up in front of my parents and she told my mom, that people like us don't belong in her world. And you sat there." I stopped. "You looked away from me." He looked at his hands. "I didn't know what to do." "I know. And I did know. I knew it was true. I also knew that not knowing what to do and doing nothing are choices, and that every choice tells you something." I didn't cry. I had been waiting to see if I would, and I didn't. What I felt instead was something quieter and more durable than tears, a kind of settling, like a structure finding its true plumb line after years of being slightly off-center. I told him I needed to sleep, and that we'd talk more tomorrow. And I meant it. I wasn't shutting down. I was just done for the night. There's a difference, and I was too tired to explain it. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Orbit made the small shuffling noise he makes when he adjusts in his sleep. Garrett came to bed quietly, an hour later, and lay on his side facing away from me, and I lay on my side facing away from him, and the space between us on the mattress felt like something that had always been there, just invisible until now. In the morning, I got up before he did. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with my mug and my phone, and I did something I had been putting off for weeks. I texted Renata. I know that sounds like an odd move, but here's the thing I'd noticed about Renata over 4 years of watching the Whitmore family from the outside. She was the only one in that house who consistently looked uncomfortable when Diane said something cruel. Not uncomfortable enough to say anything, not uncomfortable enough to push back, but uncomfortable in a way that meant she knew. She saw it. She just hadn't ever decided it was worth the cost of saying so. Last night, she'd set down her fork, and she hadn't picked it up again. My text was simple. "This is Cora. I know this is strange, but I think there are things I need to understand about the situation, and I think you might be able to help me understand them. No pressure. I just wanted to ask." I sent it, put my phone face down and drank my coffee. It buzzed 11 minutes later. Renata had written, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me for 12 years. Where do you want to meet?" I stared at that message for a long moment. 12 years. Not 4, 12. Whatever Renata knew, it went back further than my relationship with Garrett, further than Diane's lease on Hartwell Drive, further than anything I had thought this was about. I typed back, "Anywhere that isn't a house either of us rents." She sent back a coffee shop on Morse Road, Tuesday at 10, and then, after a pause, "Bring a pen. There's a lot to write down." I set my phone on the table. Outside, the morning was doing what April mornings do in Ohio, the light coming in low and pale gold through the window, the street still quiet, the kind of ordinary morning that doesn't know anything dramatic has happened and just keeps being a morning anyway. Garrett came in at 7:30, hair still flat on one side, and poured himself coffee without saying anything. He sat across from me. We looked at each other. "I called my mom this morning," he said. I waited. "She's going to contact her attorney about the lease." "Okay," I said. "Cora," Garrett. I set my mug down. "I'm meeting with Renata on Tuesday. I think there are things about your mother that I don't know yet, and I think I need to know them before I make any decisions about anything." I kept my voice level. "I'm not trying to blow up your family. I'm trying to understand what I've been living inside for 4 years, and I need you to either be okay with that or to tell me right now that you're not." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, something complicated, something I couldn't entirely read. Then he said very quietly, "What kind of decisions?" And that was the question I had been waiting for him to ask. Because the fact that he asked it that way, not "what do you need" or "I'll support you," but "what kind of decisions," told me exactly where we were. "That depends on Tuesday," I said. I picked up my mug, stood up, and went to let Orbit out of his cage for his morning fly around the living room. He landed on my shoulder immediately, the way he always does, and said, "Pretty bird," directly into my ear, and I scratched the back of his neck and thought, Tuesday, Morse Road, a pen. Whatever Renata had been sitting on for 12 years, I was about to find out. Tuesday came in gray and damp, the kind of April morning that can't decide whether it wants to rain or just threaten it all day. I got to the coffee shop on Morse Road 20 minutes early. I ordered a dark roast, found a table in the back corner away from the window, and I put a pen and a small notebook on the table in front of me. I hadn't used a paper notebook since high school. Something about Renata's message made me feel like I needed one. She walked in at exactly 10. She was wearing a rain jacket over dark slacks, no jewelry except small stud earrings, and she looked different. Different from every version of her I'd seen at Whitmore family events. Smaller somehow, more herself. She sat down across from me, wrapped both hands around the coffee cup the barista brought over, and looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "How much do you actually know about how Robert died?" I set down my pen. "Heart attack. Garrett was 19. It was sudden." Renata nodded slowly. "That's the version Diane tells." She paused. "Robert didn't die of a heart attack. The ambient noise of the coffee shop, the steam wand, the low music, 2 women talking at a table near the door, kept going like nothing had shifted. But something had." "What did he die of?" I asked. "Stroke," she said, "brought on by extreme stress. He'd found out 3 weeks before he died that Diane had been systematically moving money out of their joint accounts into a private account she'd opened in her name only. Over 4 years, roughly $340,000. She said the number the way people say numbers they've held in their mouths for a long time, precisely, without flinching. He confronted her. She told him he was paranoid. He hired an attorney. Then he had the stroke. I looked at my notebook. I hadn't written anything yet. "Does Garrett know?" "Garrett was 19 and grieving," she said. "Diane controlled the narrative completely. She was very good at it. She's always been very good at it." She looked at her cup. "I've known since the year after Robert died. He told me what he'd found, 2 weeks before the stroke. I was the only person he told. And then he was gone, and Diane was the grieving widow, and I had a choice to make." "You didn't say anything." "I was afraid of her," Renata said simply. "I'm not proud of it. But I want you to understand she is not just difficult. She is not just a snob who says cutting things at dinner tables. What she did to Robert was deliberate, and it was sustained, and it worked. And after he died, she was sitting in a house that wasn't hers, on money that wasn't hers, and everyone around her just let her. I thought about my dad, about 14 years of lease payments, about a piece of paper folded in a jacket pocket. "Does she know you know?" I asked. "She suspects," Renata said. "She's always suspected, which is why she keeps me close. You keep the people who could hurt you within arm's reach." She finally picked up her coffee. "I came to that dinner Saturday because she asked me to. She wanted a witness. She wanted someone from her side of the table when she made her point about your family. A beat. She did not anticipate your father." "Nobody anticipates my father," I said. Something close to a smile moved across Renata's face. I set down my fork when he put that paper on the table because my hands were shaking. Not from shock, from relief. She stopped. I have been waiting for something to interrupt her for a very long time. I wrote down the numbers she'd given me. $340,000, 4 years, private account. I wrote down Robert's name. I wrote down the word stroke. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to be honest with me, even if the answer is going to be hard for me to hear." She nodded. "Garrett," I said, "how much of this does he actually know, and how much has he chosen not to know?" Renata was quiet for a moment. Outside, the threatened rain finally made up its mind and started coming down against the window in a soft, steady sheet. "Garrett," she said carefully, "is a good person who has spent his entire adult life finding ways to make his mother's behavior make sense. That's different from not knowing. He's been shown the edges of things many times. He chooses where to look." She met my eyes. Saturday night, when he asked Walt if there was a way, that wasn't confusion. That was a reflex. He has been smoothing things over for her his entire life because it's the only way he's ever known how to survive her. I sat with that. Outside, a car went past on Morse Road, its tires loud on the wet asphalt. "That's not something I can fix," I said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." I drove home with the notebook on the passenger seat and the rain coming down harder now, the wipers going steady. And I thought about what Renata had said about Garrett, about the difference between not knowing and choosing where to look. I had loved him for 4 years. I had also spent 4 years watching him find ways to explain his mother, and those two things had been living in me side by side, and I had told myself they were compatible. I was starting to understand that they weren't. He was home when I got there. He was working at the kitchen table, laptop open, and he looked up when I came in. "How did it go?" I set the notebook on the counter. I took off my rain jacket. I said, "Garrett, how did your dad die?" He looked at me. "Heart attack. You know that." "Did he ever tell you he was having problems with your mom? With money?" Something moved across his face, something fast and then controlled. "He was stressed. He worked a lot. They had normal. Couples have problems, Cora. That doesn't—" "Garrett." I kept my voice level. "Renata told me about the accounts." The kitchen went very quiet. He looked at the table, at his laptop screen, at his hands, everywhere but at me. And in that sequence of avoidances, I got the answer I'd actually been asking for. "You knew," I said. Not an accusation, just a fact arriving. "I didn't know the details," he said, and his voice was low and strained. I knew they'd had a fight about money before he died. I knew she'd moved some things around. She told me she said she was protecting assets in case things got bad between them. She said he'd been threatening to—" He stopped. "She gave you a version," I said, "and you took it." "She's my mother." "I know she is." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Garrett, listen to me. I'm not asking you to stop loving her. I'm not asking you to take my side against her or anyone's side against anyone. But I am asking you to look at what she actually did, not the version she gave you, what she actually did." I folded my hands on the table. "And then I need you to tell me honestly, when you looked away from me at that table on Saturday, what were you choosing?" He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it. The thing that had been underneath all of it, the thing I'd felt in the space between us on the mattress that night. Not malice, not indifference, something sadder than both of those. A person who had learned, a very long time ago, that the cost of seeing clearly was more than he knew how to pay. "I don't know how to be in a family where she's wrong," he said. His voice broke slightly on the last word. "I never learned how." "I know," I said. "I know you didn't, and I'm so sorry that's true. I meant it. I meant it completely. But I can't be the person who keeps absorbing the cost of that while you figure it out. I've been doing it for 4 years, and I'm done." He looked at me for a long moment. "What does that mean?" "It means I love you," I said, "and it means I'm moving out." The rain was still going against the windows. Orbit was doing his midday thing in his cage, shuffling sideways on his perch, talking quietly to himself in the small, private language he has that isn't quite words. The refrigerator hummed. The laptop screen on the table had gone dark from inactivity. "Cora, I'm not doing it dramatically," I said. "I'm not angry. I'm done spending energy on a situation that isn't going to change until you decide to change it, and I can't decide that for you." I stood up. "I'm going to call my dad. I'm going to need help moving some things." He didn't try to stop me, which, I realized later, was its own kind of answer. My dad came with his truck, and my mom came with a lasagna, because that's who they are. It took 2 trips. Orbit traveled in his cage on my lap in the front seat of my car, unimpressed by the upheaval, mostly interested in the new view from the window. I moved into my parents' house temporarily, back into my old bedroom with the faded paint and the bookshelf I'd had since I was 12, and I told myself it was temporary, and believed it maybe 60%. What happened next with Diane took about 3 months to fully unfold, the way these things always do when attorneys are involved. She did contact a lawyer about the lease termination. That lawyer contacted my dad's attorney. My dad's attorney responded by sending over the full lease documentation, 14 years of payment records, and, on my dad's instruction, a copy of the records he'd quietly assembled, with Renata's formal written statement regarding the financial discrepancies in the Whitmore estate following Robert's death. He sent it not as a legal threat, but as context, as information, as a way of saying, "I know what I'm dealing with." The lease challenge dissolved within 2 weeks. Diane's attorney apparently advised her clearly and firmly that she had no case and several reasons not to draw further attention to herself. She found a rental in Upper Arlington, smaller, still nice but not $6 million nice. I heard about it from Renata, who texted me occasionally with brief, dry updates that I had come to appreciate more than almost any other form of communication in my life. The last update Renata sent me was in July. It said, "She's settled, quieter than I've ever seen her. I think she finally understands that the architecture she built was always on borrowed ground." And then, after a pause, "Thank you for being the person who asked." I thought about that for a long time, about architecture on borrowed ground, about the things we build on foundations we don't examine, about how you can live inside something for years and never think to check what's underneath it. Garrett and I talked twice more after I moved out, real conversations, the kind we'd never quite managed to have when we were living together. He was seeing a therapist. He told me that in the second call, and I was genuinely glad. Not as a concession or a consolation prize, just glad, the way you're glad when someone you care about starts doing the thing they needed to do all along. We didn't get back together. I don't think either of us expected to. But the conversations were honest in a way that felt like something being cleaned, rather than something being lost. I kept the rental house for another 2 months, paying my half of the rent while we sorted out the lease. Then Garrett took it over fully, and I found a place of my own, a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus, 3rd floor, with big windows and a fire escape where I sometimes sit in the evenings when the weather is right. Orbit likes the fire escape. He sits on my shoulder and watches the street below with enormous authority, like a very small, opinionated city planner. Sullivan's gave me a raise in June. I'd been due for one for a while and just hadn't pushed for it. I pushed for it. I got it. Turns out asking for what you're worth is easier when you've recently watched your father calmly hand a $6 million lease termination to a woman who called your mother a nobody. My parents are still on Clover Street. My dad still watches too many History Channel specials. My mom still volunteers at the library. They still grow tomatoes in the backyard, and when they come in at the end of August, fat and almost embarrassingly red, my mom brings me some in a paper bag and leaves them on my doorstep if I'm at work. I've come home to that bag on my doorstep 3 times now since I moved into the apartment, and each time it makes me feel something I don't entirely have a word for.